So hi guys, welcome to my first live stream on Medieval History Buff. Do let me know if you can hear me okay. At the moment I can see that there's we don't have any current viewers on the live stream, but I'm going to start talking anyway so you can watch. Obviously this will go into my onto the channel so you can watch it later as well. So I won't just be talking for people currently on the live stream. Obviously, there's as I said, there's nobody on here at the moment, but obviously you can watch it later on. So what I thought I'd do today is thought I'd talk about um, a couple of my recent videos on Edward the Confessor and Richard II. If you'd like to have a question answered on medieval history, on English medieval history, put it in the chat and I'll do my best to answer it. First of all, I'd just like to introduce myself a little bit because it's the first time I've done a live stream. So I'm just stopping myself there because I did put another message in the chat, but it's not come up. I'm not sure why. Yeah, so if you don't know my if you don't know the Medieval History Buff live stream, you can see on the screen at the moment there are some of my videos, some of the channel content. I do videos on medieval history, predominantly on English, but also on other European history as well. So France, Crusades, Byzantine history, Holy Roman Empire, etc. This channel was actually been running exactly 3 years to the day today, so it's kind of a. I suppose we could almost celebrate it by doing a live stream. My name is Rich. I'm 34 years old. I live in the southeast of England. I've as I've just indicated, I've been creating content for about 3 years now. I also have a blog, but I'm having a hard time getting that on Google at the moment. They're sort of mucking me around, but I'm enjoying doing the YouTube. Ideally, in an ideal world, I'll be able to get this to turn this into a something of a career, hopefully one day. But obviously, I'm not making much money out of it at the moment. But hopefully, one day I'll get around to that in the future. I have to say, I'm not massively comfortable talking on screen. This is the first time I've done this in sort of 3 years. So obviously you can see me in the corner, but my main priority has always been sharing information and sharing a passion for medieval history. So if you have any questions, do type one in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer it. Also, anybody that's watching the video, please let me know if you um, that you can that you can hear me okay. So the first topic I'll talk about in the meantime, before we get some questions hopefully coming in a bit, I'll be talking about a little bit about my Edward the Confessor video, which you can see on the screen at the moment at the top there. It was one of my longest videos that I've done for a It was probably my longest video that I've ever done. That I've done for about a couple of years now. I would say it was 18 minutes long, so there's a lot of effort went into it. I have to say, Edward the Confessor, I find to be quite an interesting man. He he was probably what I would call a bridge between Anglo-Saxon England and Norman conquest England. He reigned from 1042 to 1066. Before his reign, there was there was a period of essentially Viking rule over England from King Canute, his father Svein Forkbeard, up to Harold Harefoot and Arthur Canute. So there was about nearly 30 years of Danish rule over England. So Edward the Confessor, he was kind of the last long reigning Anglo-Saxon king over England. Obviously, we had Harold II immediately after him, reigned for about 9 months. But well, he did reign for 9 months. He became king on the death of Edward in January 1066, and obviously died at Hastings. But back to Edward the Confessor, he was. I think I think some people find him a hard king to sum up, but just studying him, I personally think he was a pretty capable king. He reigned for, as I say, for 24 years, and in that time, England was a relatively calm and stable place. I would say not he didn't have too many major issues as king. His biggest issue was Earl Godwin. Earl Godwin was one of the most powerful men in England, in pre-Norman conquest England. Really, in fact, it could be argued he was more powerful than not only Edward the Confessor, but also the kings before him, Arthur Canute and Harold Harefoot. He was a really dominant presence in England. He was the Earl of Mercia. Edward really kind of, I think he struggled to contain not only Earl Godwin, sorry, but also his sons. Having studied it first, it was really probably doing this video on Edward the Confessor. It was probably my first time really studying Godwin and his family in any real detail. And I have to say, what I was kind of surprised that actually, really, Earl Godwin's son, Svein, was particularly. Sorry, yeah, sorry, he was Earl of Wessex. Sorry, I misspoke there. I had two things on my mind. Thank you for pointing that out. But Earl Godwin was sorry, what was it? Yeah, Earl Godwin's son, Svein, was a particularly troublesome figure as well. So it wasn't just a case of Edward the Confessor trying to control Earl Godwin. His sons were a problem as well. Svein, in 1051, actually murdered a distant relative called Earl Bjorn, and this led to him being exiled. But he essentially returned to England not long after, and Edward the Confessor forgave him pretty readily. And I think this showed you that this is a slight indicator that Edward had a bit of a weak spot when it came to the Godwins, and that point got proved further as well in also in 1051. The Count of Boulogne was visiting the southeast of England. I'm not sure why, but he was visiting the southeast of England, and he was in Dover, and a dispute broke out between the people of Kent, and more specifically Dover, and between them and the Count of Boulogne, and things became quite violent, which led to quite serious trouble. And King Edward, he basically ordered Earl Godwin to march into Kent and to deal with this trouble. Which again, obviously, the king having to turn to Godwin shows you who the main man was really. But Godwin refused. He basically told the king he would not side with a foreign count over fellow Englishmen. He would not harm fellow Englishmen, even if they were in the wrong. And this was a massive kind of statement, really. It was undermining Edward's authority and the little authority he actually had. And so Edward, unsurprisingly, he became really quite angry at kind of Godwin's insolence, basically. And this there was a council held in London to kind of discuss the matter. But Godwin was actually in fear for his safety at this point, and he was demanding hostages from the king to essentially act as assurances that he wouldn't be harmed at this meeting. But the king was demanding that Godwin would pay homage to him. So that there was kind of a tug of war at this point, and in the end, it led to the council meeting led to essentially no agreement being reached, and Godwin and his son Svein sailed over the channel with Godwin's wife and his other son Tostig, whilst another of Godwin's sons, Harold, famously Harold Godwinson, sailed to Ireland. So things were kind of at a standstill. I'm certain that Edward the Confessor didn't expect that Earl Godwin would stay away forever. In fact, I'm almost certain he knew he would return, and the Godwins returned the following year. On arriving back in England, the Godwins sacked, um, essentially sacked across the south coast of England, and obviously, again, this was sending the king a very clear message that they weren't gonna they weren't just gonna go away, and in the end, that they were essentially too powerful for the king to ignore. And they obviously that they came back into power, and Edward, who was married to Earl Godwin's daughter Edith, he'd sent her into a convent essentially, but he was kind of forced to bring her back into the fold, and it just he'd almost been bullied a little bit at this point because he just knew Earl Godwin, as I say, was simply too powerful to ignore. For Edward, though, he kind of had a bit of relief the following year in 1053 when Earl Godwin died. He died in quite dramatic fashion. Actually, there was a celebration feast. I think it was in sort of around Easter time, 1053, when he sort of collapsed whilst at a celebration feast. I think from the symptoms that were described, I think he probably died of a stroke, which would be so, and he died in front of his two sons, Harold and Tostig, who were also there, which was obviously would have been fairly upsetting for them. But for Edward the Confessor to really, I think Earl Godwin was a massively overbearing presence, and to see him, to see him drop dead actually wouldn't have been a major concern for him. So obviously, once Earl Godwin died, he was kind of succeeded to his earldom of Wessex by Harold, and Harold kind of served the king in a kind of slightly more loyal fashion, although there was still trouble between him and some of his other brothers. But as I kind of indicated earlier, that was sort of the major problem of Edward's reign was dealing with Earl Godwin and his family. But there was another problem, as one of the Brandon has indicated in the comments. Edward didn't have an heir. Now, throughout his entire reign, 24-year long reign, it seems that Edward didn't really show any signs of urgency when it came to producing an heir. Now, I tend to believe that this was because of his religious convictions. However, a lot of modern historians now are sort of quite dismissive of that, and they're kind of, I think some of them are kind of leaning more towards the fact that perhaps Edward maybe had some sort of medical issue. But what I tend to find with modern historians is that they're quite contrarian in their that in their kind of their viewpoints now. Anything that's been kind of not established as fact, but anything that's kind of held that's been, so what's the word? It kind of almost a belief that's been held for a long time with regards to an issue in medieval history. They tend to want to contradict it. That's what I find with modern historians, and that's one of the big. I think I would find it quite. This is why I find a lot of academic stuff quite hard to digest now, because historians always kind of have their own sort of little agenda. Yeah, with regards to yeah, so just getting back to Edward the Confessor, and he's not producing a son. I think the main issue for me is that he probably didn't want. It was probably his religious convictions that led to him not having an heir, and obviously anyone trying to assert that it was maybe some sort of medical issue. Well, unfortunately, it's now nearly 1,000 years later, and there's absolutely no way of proving or disproving that there was something medically wrong with Edward. But if we go along with the fact that it was his religious convictions that led to him not having an heir, whilst on the surface, people may consider that to be almost praiseworthy. Well, actually, I mean, in the eyes of history, actually, it's an act of, you would have to call it neglect, because it obviously it led directly to the Norman conquest, which kind of brings us back to who was the rightful king of England after Edward the Confessor. In 1051, during kind of the height of Edward's troubles with Edward the Confessor, with the Earl Godwin situation, he was visited at his court by a young duke, Duke William of Normandy. Now, there is no way of telling what happened during William's visit to England. Obviously, but in William's mind, clearly later on, he felt that some sort of promise had been made that he would become the next king of England after Edward's death. But would Edward have committed to that? I'm not so sure. Okay, William was, at that point, at the time of his visit to England, he was probably about 23, 24. So he would have been, and obviously he was a physically powerful looking young man. He was, it would have been quite impressive to Edward. Edward during his early years, would have spent some time in exile, spent a long time in exile in Normandy. So perhaps he did feel some sort of connection with Duke William. It's possible possible, although this is pure speculation on my part, as somebody left a comment on my video indicated that Edward may have met the young Duke William, but but William would have been very young, no older than 6 or 7, at the time of their first sort of meeting. So did Edward feel a connection with William enough to make him his heir? I'm not sure that's likely, because at the end of the day, I do think Edward would have wanted to be succeeded by an Anglo-Saxon king of England. So by the time we get to 1066, well, actually, if we go back to 1065, Edward actually had a few options when it came to selecting a potential successor. He had Duke William, as we've indicated. Obviously, he had Harold Godwinson, who was, again, after his father had died, he became one of the most preeminent men in England, who served the king well, proved himself militarily in Wales, shown himself to be a capable administrator. So, and obviously he was an Anglo-Saxon or an Englishman. So he to me he would have stood above Duke William as Edward's preference to succeed him. But as Brandon has indicated, really, probably the lawful successor to Edward was probably Edgar Atheling, the son of Edward the Exile. Edgar was, as I say, the son of Edward the Exile, who was the son of Edmund Ironside. He had obviously he had strong ties to the English crown. Really, technically, the succession with the English throne was really kind of muddied by King Canute's father, Svein Forkbeard, kicking Athelred the Unready off the throne. Really, if Athelred the Unready had passed the throne on to his son without Canute's interference, it would have gone to Edmund Ironside, and then Edmund Ironside, in theory, would have passed the throne onto his son Edward the Exile, then Edgar Atheling. But the Viking sort of intrusions and then the Danish seizing of the English crown eventually kind of muddied matters somewhat. So really, in theory, the throne should have passed to Edgar Atheling. But at the time of Edward the Confessor's death, he was only 13 years of age. Edward the Exile, his father, having died in 1057, having just arrived back in England. He died not long after his arrival back in England, unfortunately. So Edward the Exile was out of the picture. And with Edgar only being a young boy, he was now competing against Duke William and Harold Godwinson for the throne, when in reality, who were much more experienced than Edgar. And really, although the succession to the English crown pre-Norman conquest, although we're obviously getting up to that point with the conquest, it was a little bit more flexible than it became after the Norman conquest of England. It was a little bit more flexible. So if you go back to the time of Alfred the Great, for example, in 871, there were actually two young boys who actually should have become King of Wessex ahead of Alfred, but because Alfred was sort of in his mid to early 20s, it was preferable that he became king instead of those two young boys, because at that time the Viking wars were really obviously beginning to escalate, and so having a grown man instead of young children as king was obviously preferable. So obviously the succession at that time was it was a little bit more flexible up until Norman conquest. Then it became a little bit more rigid, but even then there were still, obviously, even after William the Conqueror became king, there were still examples of people usurping the line of succession. King John, for example, when he became king in 1199, he'd been made heir of his brother Richard the Lionheart, even though technically Richard and John's nephew Arthur should have become king instead. So there were always kind of little contradictions in who succeeded as King of England throughout the Middle Ages. Obviously, famously, Richard III, he usurped his own nephews later on by making up essentially a bullshit story, basically. So going back to Edward the Confessor, when he died in January 1066, there were 4 men who could have become king. Well, 3 men and one young boy: Duke William, Harold Godwinson, Edgar Atheling, and obviously Harold Hardrada of Norway. Harold Hardrada had a fairly flimsy sort of claim to the crown. It was, I can't remember exactly what it was. I'd have to be reminded. There was some sort of, I think there was some sort of agreement during the time of King Canute. I think I'd have to research that bit. So that there were 4 options, but realistically, only 2 of them were going to become king, because Harold Godwinson and William the Conqueror, well, William Duke of Normandy, were adamant that they were going to become king. Edgar Atheling, really, even though he was the rightful heir, was now really kind of sidelined almost. Harold Hardrada of Norway would make an effort to become king, but obviously he was defeated and killed at Stamford Bridge. But all this sort of trouble had been caused directly by Edward the Confessor not having a son. If he just had a son, and that son had survived infancy and grown into adulthood, then actually all the turmoil of 1066 and the Norman conquest would have been avoided. So I think, really, for me, having looked at and studied Edward the Confessor in detail, I would describe him as a capable king, but his one big failing was securing the succession. And really, ultimately, when it came to medieval kings, they were judged not just by what they did during their reign, but how they left things, what happened in the reign that followed theirs. So, for example, if you look at Henry I, who reigned from 1100 to 1135, he was a very good king. He ruled well. He had strong laws, albeit in some cases too strong. He was particularly fond of mutilating people, mutilating criminals. But Henry I was a really good king. But after his son and heir died in 1120, he only had one legitimate child, a daughter, the Empress Matilda, who could potentially succeed him. All the other options were either illegitimate children or, obviously, as we saw in 1135, Count Stephen of Blois, Matilda's cousin. By not securing the throne, by not securing the succession by not producing more male heirs, Henry I, after he died in 1135, left a country that would eventually erupt into civil war as Stephen and Matilda fought over the crown. Henry wanted Matilda to succeed, but that realistically was never going to happen, because people didn't like her, because they viewed her as being arrogant, although I think that's probably more to do with sexism, to be honest. They just didn't want a woman to rule, not at that time anyway. And this led to 19 years of, as we've seen in the comments, anarchy. So when a king didn't have half an eye on what was to happen after his reign, which was the case of Edward the Confessor, it always led to trouble. And by not producing that son, Edward the Confessor really tarnished his legacy, which otherwise could have been pretty positive if he just secured the succession, and not even necessarily by producing an heir, even, but by but he had plenty of time to outline who would succeed him. You know, at some point throughout the 1050s, Edward should have decided who was going to be his designated heir. If he wasn't going to have a son, and he would have realised that at some point that was looking unlikely, even if it was by design or otherwise. He had Edgar Atheling and Edward the Exile to choose from potentially. He had Harold Godwinson. He had Duke William. If he publicly outlined his wishes for the succession and communicated it to the public, then all the turmoil of 1066 would have been avoided, and some of the horrendous scenes that we saw during the reign of William the Conqueror, such as his massacre of the northern population in 1070, which I consider to be probably one of the great atrocities of the Middle Ages. So to sum up Edward the Confessor, I would call him, ultimately, I think you'd have to call him a failure, but he could have been a really good king, actually. If he'd been a bit tougher on the Godwins and he'd just secured that succession, he actually could have been regarded as one of England's best kings, actually. But alas, that's one of history's great what ifs, isn't it? So, having discussed Edward the Confessor, the other king I wanted to talk about today was Richard II. He reigned from 1377 to 1399, and he's a really interesting character for me, Richard II. He's a bit of a enigma. Some people view him as being a tyrant, and I was I was inclined to think of him that way myself, but I'm not sure he was. He was more petulant, and he was more petulant than a tyrant, I think. He became king aged only 10 in 1377. He'd followed on from his grandfather Edward III, who's one of England's greatest ever kings. So he had a hard act to follow. Edward III hadn't left England in the best situation, because over the last 10 years before his death, he'd allowed things to kind of slip out of control a little bit in terms of finances. He'd fallen into poor health, and he'd been exploited by people around him, and so Richard inherited a country that was obviously not in great health financially, and in 1381 the peasants' revolt exploded, and he actually dealt with that okay. Obviously, he saw his treasurer and Archbishop of Canterbury being executed, as well as other key men, which was obviously for a 14-year-old king, that would have been quite traumatic. But as I say, he dealt with it. He came out with that with some credit. He kind of, by sort of talking to the rebels at Smithfield, I think it was. By talking to the rebels, he managed to calm the situation down after a lot of destruction had been caused. So that was, much to his credit, that was brave. And then in the aftermath, he came down hard on the rebels, and a lot of them were eventually executed. The main ones, Wat Tyler was cut down by the mayor of London, John Ball, Jack Straw. They were all killed. But the problem with that is that after the peasants' revolt had been dealt with, Richard became sort of a bit of an egomaniac. He had favourites at court. He had favourite ministers that he allowed to kind of dictate matters a bit too much. And eventually this led to hostility with a group of nobles called the Lords Appellant. And in the late 1380s, 1388, a parliament was held called the Merciless Parliament, where a number of Richard's ministers were either exiled or executed. Some had fled. Some had actually fled into exile and been sentenced to death in their absence, which for a king like Richard II, this was a tremendous blow to his his prestige, if you will. He had a great sense of self-worth, and this was a massive undermining of his kingly status. And so for years after that, although Richard was kind of backed into a corner, he kind of stewed on this kind of insult into his, as I say, into his kind of kingly prestige. His uncle, Richard John of Gaunt, although he wasn't massively popular himself, in fact, he was despised because of his serious wealth. He came back to England, having travelled to Castile, and he managed just to keep things together a little bit between Richard and the Lords Appellant. One of the Lords Appellant, Henry Bolingbroke, he Richard's cousin, and later Henry IV, he actually travelled overseas and joined the Northern Crusades on a couple of occasions, where apparently he conducted himself pretty well. That was probably a good idea at that time, sort of in the 1390s, because Richard and Henry were obviously now sworn enemies. But by 1397, Richard saw an opportunity to come down hard on his enemies, and eventually he banished Henry Bolingbroke, Thomas Mowbray into exile. He even had his own uncle, Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, son of Edward III, executed in Calais. These were the men who had tried to keep Richard in check, and had tried to not allow him to almost become that tyrant people felt he was or becoming. But this was nearly a decade after the Merciless Parliament, so it goes to show you that Richard had never forgotten or forgiven what had been done to him. And so this petty nature, this inability to forgive, eventually came back to haunt Richard. In 1399, John of Gaunt died, and instead of allowing, obviously with John's son and successor Henry Bolingbroke in exile, Richard essentially stole the Duchy of Lancaster for himself. The duchy being incredibly wealthy and bringing in a lot of money. But as I said, the duchy should have passed to Henry Bolingbroke. But with Richard stealing it for himself, he brought in a lot of money for the crown, or so he thought. Richard then, for some reason, sailed to Ireland. This gave Henry Bolingbroke a massive opportunity. England was essentially left unguarded by the king. Henry Bolingbroke returned to England in order initially to reclaim what should have been his inheritance, the Duchy of Lancaster. But after Henry had landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, he found support for him actually was increasing the more he travelled across England, and he realised that actually he could potentially take the crown of England, being a grandson of Edward III himself. Richard, on hearing of Henry's arrival in England, sailed back across the Irish Sea in a desperate hurry, but found by the time he'd landed in Wales that he'd left things far too late. Richard was eventually captured by his enemies and forced to abdicate at the Tower of London in 1399. This was an event that was entirely self-inflicted. Richard essentially got what he deserved, really, because his campaign in Ireland was probably one of the great acts of stupidity from any medieval king. Henry Bolingbroke was now King Henry IV, and Richard II was transported to Pontefract Castle, which had belonged to John of Gaunt. And it was here that Richard would eventually meet his death. Now, if you'd watch one of my videos called "The Violent Death of Richard II," you'll see me talking about a different version of events as to explain how Richard died. Now, the conventional belief is that Richard was starved to death in a prison cell at Pontefract. But in this account, which was a contemporary account written by an anonymous author, basically said that Richard was actually killed violently by a group of knights sent to Pontefract by Henry IV. According to this anonymous account, Richard was killed by two blows of the axe to the head. However, unfortunately, this story, whilst it's more colourful than just simply being starved to death, was unfortunately a little bit more. Unfortunately, is basically false. Essentially, Richard was the reason that we can say for certain that it was false is, firstly, the author actually says that Richard was actually buried at Pontefract Castle, which he wasn't. Richard died on in the middle of February, 14th of February, 1400. 3 days later, he was transported to London, not buried at Pontefract Castle, and he was put on public display. His body was put on public display at St Paul's Cathedral. This was to show to the public that Richard had died of natural causes and not been violently killed. Now, if somebody had struck Richard in the head twice with an axe, that would be pretty hard to cover up. Now, potentially, I suppose the head could be covered in some sort of way, but that would have aroused suspicion. And as I said, the fact that the author got something as pretty basic as where Richard was buried wrong is an indicator that this is not an account that's overly trustworthy. So I think it's safe to say that Richard starved to death at Pontefract Castle. Having said that, even then, there's still there are some people who actually say that Richard actually voluntarily starved himself to death. But I think it's probably more than likely that Henry Bolingbroke had ordered for Richard to be starved to death, because in January 1400 there was a plot to overthrow Henry Bolingbroke called the Windsor Plot. This involved a group of nobles going to Windsor Castle, where Henry Bolingbroke was staying with his family, and killing the new king. Whilst this is this would have been a tremendous shock to Henry Bolingbroke, and it was a very serious threat to him, and so he now knew that he could not allow Richard to live. Essentially, now they were cousins, So whether Henry felt some sort of loyalty to him at this point, because it had been 3 months since Richard had been officially deposed. So whether Henry felt some sort of loyalty to this to his cousin, I don't know, and because potentially, really realistically, after Richard being deposed, he probably should have been killed there and then, pretty much. But after the Windsor plot, Henry Bolingbroke had no choice but to have him removed or eliminated. So Richard II's reign had reigned for 22 years, but he was a king position on himself, completely on himself. It was so avoidable. It's just not true. If he just managed to show a little bit more flexibility, not allow himself to become controlled by certain men in his government, and then being a bit more forgiving even after the merciless Parliament, he would have avoided deposition. But interestingly, what made Richard II's situation a little bit more vulnerable to deposition was essentially the same problem that Edward the Confessor had. He had no son and heir. This was, if Richard had produced a son and heir, then the chance of him being deposed would have been less, even if he'd still gone on campaign in Ireland. Because if Henry had deposed him, the throne would have passed. Really, the throne would have passed to Richard's son. So Henry would have had less grounds to depose the king. Why Richard didn't have a son, I'm not sure. He had a wife that he was particularly fond of, Anne of Bohemia, but she died young in 1394, a death that Richard didn't take very well. He had a brawl at her funeral with a nobleman who had turned up late for the funeral, and he tore down the palace where she had died. So obviously Richard was very fond of his first wife, but having had her killed, having with her dead, perhaps he felt too grief stricken, at least for a couple of years, to think about the succession. His next wife was a young girl, Isabella, whom he married when she was only 6. This was part of a peace agreement that kind of really put a halt to the English wars in France. So with that marriage probably can indicate one of two things. One, that Richard didn't expect he'd be usurped, because he was, at the time of his marriage, I believe he was 29, 28 or 29. 29, I think he was. And he'd married a girl who was probably at least 10 years away from being able to produce a son and heir. So that either indicates that Richard was not prioritizing the succession, or that he certainly expected to be king for a long time yet. But that probably shows either a sense of arrogance or a sense of naivety. Richard had plenty of time to produce children with Anne of Bohemia, but failed to do so. And these sort of decisions left himself vulnerable to usurpation, and we saw that in 1399. So that's kind of a brief overview of Edward the Confessor and Richard II. I hope you've enjoyed it. As I say, today was more kind of just a bit of a trial run. I really appreciate the comments that have been left in the chat. I think over time, what I wasn't able to do really, I wasn't able to prepare for this as thoroughly as I would have liked, but I'm still pretty pleased with how it's gone. As I say, it's a little bit of a trial run, so I think what I'm going to try and do in the future is try and have one of these sort of Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays. Obviously, I didn't expect to get too many viewers today, so the comments have all been really appreciated. So hopefully over time we'll be able to get more people to view, and hopefully to leave questions in the chat. Make it more sort of make it as dynamic as we possibly can. I think what I'll do for the first few of these, I will keep it as the same sort of format, sort of a general discussion, but also with a Q&A to sort of go alongside it. Ideally, as we sort of grow the channel, we sort of hopefully do more. Hopefully, hopefully we'll get more questions and more discussion points in the chat. But I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you have too. And hopefully in the future, as time goes on and we do more and more of these, I'll be able to refine it a little bit more and get a little bit better at it. But I think it's gone pretty well. So thank you for watching this stream, and also if you're watching this stream later on, do leave comments in the comment section, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.